All right, so we're diving deep today into California's workers' comp system. We're going to be looking at Chapter 5 from what looks like a handbook on this whole thing. And yeah, we're going to unpack the basics, of course, but we also want to go a little deeper, right? Find some of those details that maybe most folks don't know about and that could
Yeah.
actually end up, saving you some trouble or even money down the road. You ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. So California's constitution itself actually guarantees a comprehensive workers' comp system. Like, I was actually surprised to learn that.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the state constitution really lays this strong foundation, It's not just a set of laws, it's really like a core social principle in California.
Yeah.
This emphasis on, comfort, health, and general welfare for workers.
Yeah, and it's not just, vague language or whatever. The Constitution actually gets pretty specific, like mandating things like safety measures, obviously medical care if you get injured on the job, insurance to cover those costs, and a fair system for resolving disputes, if any, come up.
Absolutely. And it's not just, about patching people up after an accident happens, right? It's about creating a system where worker well-being is like paramount,
Yeah.
really baked into this system.
Okay, so let's get into the actual benefits that injured workers can get in California. This chapter we're looking at breaks down six types of benefits. First up, medical treatment. And one thing that jumped out at me is this. The legal standard for treatment is cure or relieve. That seems pretty broad, right?
It is. And the point
Yeah.
is to get you back as close as you can to the state of health you were in before the injury. Not just to address the immediate symptoms, but to actually try to cure or relieve the effects of the injury.
Yeah.
And here's something that I think will surprise people. Employers actually have to authorize up to $10,000 in treatment within one working day of a claim.
Whoa, that's a tight deadline.
Yeah. No dragging their feet. You get the care you need right away.
That's got to make a huge difference for someone dealing with a sudden injury.
Absolutely. And it eliminates financial barriers and, just ensures prompt access to care, which is crucial for a good recovery.
Okay.
And it's important to note this covers future treatment needs too, even after a claim is settled.
That's great peace of mind. All right, the next benefit is temporary disability payments. And this is where things get a little tricky, so listen up. There are two categories here: temporary total disability, which is TTD, and temporary partial disability, or TPD.
Right. And both of these really focus on wage loss. If you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it's all about recognizing that injuries impact your ability to earn a living, even temporarily.
Okay, so TTD, that's for when you can't work at all because of your injury, and TPD is for when you can work, but, maybe have to cut back on hours or take a less demanding role that pays less.
Exactly. Benefits aim to cushion that financial blow while you're, recovering.
And both are calculated as two-thirds of your average weekly earnings rate, but there's a cap, of course.
Right. There's a maximum weekly benefit amount, but here's the catch. You don't actually get any temporary disability payments for the first 3 days you miss work,
Mm-hmm.
unless you're hospitalized or out for more than 14 days.
Yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind. And, another important point is all of these disability benefits are tax-free.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Little silver lining. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to permanent disability payments. This applies when you know the injury has a lasting impact, you don't fully recover.
Right. And it's based on your lost earning power, meaning how the injury affects your ability to, earn a living in the long run.
So how do they figure out how much you'll get?
Well, you're assigned to disability rating a percentage. That percentage then translates into a specific number of weeks of payments.
Interesting. And this chapter also mentions this 15% increase or decrease rule based on whether the employer offers modified work. What is that about?
It's a really interesting incentive built into the system. So if your employer offers you modified work, within 60 days of your injury becoming permanent and you're eligible for it, then your permanent disability payments could be reduced by 15%. But if they don't offer you any modified work, your payments could actually increase by 15%.
Oh, so it encourages employers to be proactive.
Right.
Accommodate injured workers whenever possible.
Right. It's about encouraging collaboration and, finding solutions that work for both sides.
I like that. Okay, next up, we've got something called Supplemental Job Displacement Benefits, or SJDBs for short. And this seems particularly helpful for those who, can't go back to their old job because of the injury.
It is. Think of it this way.
Yeah.
Sometimes an injury forces you to pivot,
Yeah.
change your career path. And the SJDB is designed to help you make that transition successfully.
So it's basically a voucher you can use for retraining or skill enhancement programs at approved schools, right, Late?
Exactly. It's about empowering you to rebuild your career even after a serious injury. The amount of the voucher does depend on, the date of your injury and how severe your disability is.
Okay, so we're getting into those nuances now that most folks probably don't know about. This is good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the Return to Work Fund. I'm still a little fuzzy on this one. What's the main takeaway?
Think of this fund as a safety net, especially for workers whose permanent disability benefits end up being much lower than the actual earnings they've lost.
So it's for those who are hit hardest financially.
Exactly right. It's designed to help bridge that gap and ensure a more just outcome when the standard benefits, fall short. The state actually sets aside $120 million every year for this.
Wow, okay. Now the last benefit we need to talk about is a sensitive one, death benefits. Sadly, this applies when an employee passes away from a work-related injury or illness.
It is a difficult topic, but it's important to understand. Death benefits are intended to provide financial support to the deceased worker's dependents. Usually that's, a spouse, children, or others who relied on them financially.
And the amount of those benefits is based on...
It's based on the deceased worker's average weekly earnings at the time of their death, and also takes into account how many dependents they had. It also includes burial expenses.
Okay, so we've gone through all 6 types of benefits offered under the California Workers' Comp system. This is already a lot to take in. Are you ready to keep going?
Absolutely. Let's get into the next section.
Okay, so let's unpack this next section here. We've covered the basics of those 6 benefit types, but now I want to kind of zoom in a bit, right? Get into some specifics that might not be so obvious, For example, when it comes to temporary disability payments, the chapter kind of goes deeper into temporary partial disability, or TPD. What's the main thing our listeners should really get about this one?
Well, it really comes down to the nitty-gritty of wage loss. Remember, TPD is when you're still able to work, but you're earning less because of your injury. Maybe you're working fewer hours, or you had to switch to a less demanding role that, doesn't pay as much.
Right. So it's like even if you're not totally out of commission, your injury could still be costing you money, real money.
Exactly. And TPD aims to cover 2/3 of that lost income.
Yeah.
So they calculate it based on the difference between your pre-injury earnings and what you're making now.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, I was making $1,000 a week before my injury, and now I can only do a part-time gig that brings in, say, $600. Would TPD cover 2/3 of that $400 difference?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Of course, there are maximum limits, but it's designed to help ease that financial strain while you're on the mend,
Okay. This chapter also points out something that I found kind of sobering. It talks about, full-time workers facing huge earnings losses, even with disability benefits. What's that about?
Well, yeah, it's a harsh reality. Even with disability benefits, your income's likely to take a hit,
Yeah.
especially if you were earning a good salary before your injury. Those 2/3 payments, even with a cap, they might not even come close to what you were making before.
It's a good reminder that having a financial safety net, like, disability insurance, is crucial no matter how much you make.
Absolutely. You never know when you might need it.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit here and talk about permanent disability payments. I noticed this chapter specifically calls out payments lasting 104 weeks. What's significant about that time frame?
Well, that's generally the limit for temporary disability payments, within a 5-year period following the date of your injury. So after 104 weeks, those payments would typically stop.
But I'm guessing there are some exceptions.
Of course, especially for chronic or severe injuries, The chapter lists a few examples: hepatitis amputations, severe burns, HIV, certain lung conditions.
Yeah, those are some serious long-term health issues.
Exactly. And for those types of injuries, that TD limit can be extended to 240 weeks. It recognizes that, recovery and the ability to return to work can take much longer in those cases.
It's a good thing the system has that flexibility built in. Now, when we talk about permanent disability, there's also this thing called a life pension. What's that all about?
Well, a life pension is basically a safety net for workers who have permanent partial disabilities of 70% or more. So
Right.
their ability to work is, significantly impaired. And after they've received their allotted, permanent disability payments, which are based on their disability rating and average weekly earnings, they'll start to receive a smaller ongoing pension for the rest of their lives.
Oh, okay. So it's a way of providing long-term support,
Yeah.
recognizing that a severe injury can impact your finances for a lifetime.
Right. It's about making sure that workers who have suffered life-altering injuries, aren't left high and dry.
Okay, let's dive into supplemental job displacement benefits, or SJDBs. This section breaks down this whole voucher system based on the date of injury. Why is that?
The rules governing SJDBs have changed over time, So when your injury happened, makes a big difference in terms of what you're eligible for and how much you might get.
So for injuries that happened between 2004 and 2012, it mentions a voucher system. How does that work?
So if your injury is preventing you from returning to your old job, you might be eligible for a voucher that you can use for retraining or skill enhancement programs at approved schools.
Hmm.
You know,
Oh, okay. So like a chance to learn some new skills and reinvent yourself professionally.
exactly. The value of the voucher depends on how severe your disability is. It can range from $4,000 to $10,000. It's not a fortune, but it can help you get back on your feet career-wise.
That's a great opportunity. And for injuries after 2013?
For injuries after 2013, there's still a voucher program, but it's a bit different. The amount is now fixed at $6,000 for all disability levels. And it's a lot more flexible in terms of what you can use it for.
How so?
Well, it's not just for tuition anymore. You can use it for things like licensing fees, tools for your new trade, even a computer. It's about recognizing the practical needs of someone starting over in a new field.
That's a smart update. This chapter also says the voucher can cover up to 10% for vocational and return to work counseling. Why is that included?
Well, it recognizes that making a career change after an injury can be really daunting. You might need help with things like, choosing a new field, finding the right training programs, or even just, marketing your new skills to potential employers. So this provision helps cover those support services.
Makes sense. All right, let's move on to the Return to Work Fund. I'm still not totally clear on who this is for and how it works.
It's basically a safety net for those whose permanent disability benefits end up being much lower than what they were actually earning before. You see, even with permanent disability payments, some workers are left with a big financial gap, especially if they were making a good salary before the injury.
So it's an extra layer of protection for those who are, really struggling financially because of their injury.
Exactly. It acknowledges that sometimes the standard benefits just aren't enough. The state has set aside $120 million every year to help supplement those payments, and to make sure things are more equitable.
That's good to know. But how do you know if you even qualify for this extra support?
There are specific rules and guidelines, to determine who's eligible. It's not just a random handout. It's all laid out in the regulations.
So if you're in a situation where you know your permanent disability benefits aren't cutting it, it's worth looking into whether you might qualify for help from this Return to Work Fund.
Absolutely. Don't leave money on the table.
Okay, so now let's talk about the actual process of, initiating benefits. What are the first steps an injured worker should take?
The most important thing is to report the injury to your employer as soon as possible, ideally within 30 days.
And what happens after you report it?
Well, your employer is legally obligated to give you the claim form, it's called DWC-1, and also to direct you to a doctor for treatment.
So it's a joint effort then between the worker and the employer.
That's right. And, timely reporting and cooperation from both sides are crucial to making sure the process goes smoothly.
Okay, this chapter also highlights the role of the treating physician as being very important. Why is that?
The treating physician is really vital.
Yeah.
You know, think of them as the expert witness for your case. Their documentation of your injury treatment plan progress reports, all of that is key evidence that helps determine if you're eligible for benefits.
So it's really important to find a doctor who understands the whole workers' comp system.
Yeah.
Someone who can advocate for you.
Couldn't agree more. It's a complex system, and having a doctor who knows how to navigate it can make all the difference.
Now, we've talked about how employers can't discriminate against injured workers, but this chapter mentions a business necessity exception. What's that about?
It's a very narrow exception, and it only applies to termination during temporary disability. Basically, it means an employer could terminate an injured worker if they can prove they have a legitimate business reason that has absolutely nothing to do with the injury.
Okay, so if the company is downsizing or the employee's position is being eliminated for reasons totally unrelated to their injury, that could be a valid defense.
Yeah, that's the idea. But it's a high bar for employers to clear. They have to show real evidence that the termination isn't just a way to get rid of an injured worker.
So it's a safeguard to prevent employers from taking advantage of that exception.
Exactly. The system has to protect workers while also, recognizing that businesses have legitimate needs too.
Right, of course. Now, this chapter also mentions the Americans with Disabilities Act and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. How do those laws come into play here?
Think of those as extra layers of protection against discrimination. They require employers to make reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities. And they also say that employers can't take negative actions like demotions or firings based on past workers' comp claims.
So even after you've recovered from your injury, your employer can't hold it against you.
That's right. These laws help create a more level playing field for workers who've, experienced work-related injuries or illnesses.
That makes a lot of sense. We've covered a lot of ground here, unpacked all kinds of details and nuances. Is there anything else in this chapter that you think is really important for our listener to know?
Well, there's one more interesting thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's how death benefits work in relation to dependents. It's a sensitive topic, but I think it's worth exploring.
Totally agree. I think that's a great place to pick up when we come back for part 3. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into California's workers' compensation system. And as we wrap up this chapter, we need to talk about a topic that's both sensitive and really crucial, and that's death benefits.
It's not an easy thing to talk about,
Yeah.
but understanding how death benefits work is, essential, especially for those who have families who depend on them.
Right. And we've already touched on the fact that these benefits are meant to provide financial support to the family of a worker who dies from a work-related injury or illness. But how do dependents actually factor into all of this?
Well, the amount of the death benefit and, who receives it is directly tied to the deceased worker's dependents.
Yeah.
It's all about figuring out who relied on that worker for financial support and to what extent.
So who exactly qualifies as a dependent in this context?
California law lays out some, clear guidelines, but generally it includes a spouse and children, anyone else who is financially dependent on the deceased worker.
I imagine there are specific rules around like who qualifies and how much each dependent gets right.
Oh, absolutely. There are detailed regulations that spell out, dependency and how benefit amounts are calculated.
Yeah.
It's a complex area, and sometimes you really need a lawyer's expertise to sort it all out.
This chapter mentions that the death benefit amount varies depending on the number of total or partial dependents. What's the difference there?
It's about, the level of financial reliance. A total dependent is someone who was completely supported by the deceased worker, like a young child or a non-working spouse.
So they had no other income at all.
Right. A partial dependent, on the other hand, might have gotten some support from the deceased worker, but they also had other sources of income, maybe a part-time job or help from another family member.
Okay, so for example, like a working spouse or an adult child living at home, but, contributing to household expenses would probably be considered a partial dependent.
Exactly. And the death benefit they'd get would reflect that, partial dependency.
And how is the overall benefit amount calculated?
Primarily, it's based on the deceased worker's average weekly earnings at the time of their death. So, a worker who's making a higher salary would generally lead to higher death benefits for their dependents.
That makes sense. It's about trying to replace as much as possible the income that's been lost. Are there any limits on how much the death benefit can be?
Yeah, California law sets both minimum and maximum limits for death benefits, and they adjust those limits every now and then to account for inflation.
Okay, good to know. This chapter also mentions that death benefits continue for dependent minors until a certain age. What's the cutoff?
For injuries that happened after 1990, benefits keep going until the youngest minor dependent turns 18. This is to make sure that, children who lose a parent because of a work-related incident have some financial support until they become adults.
But what if a minor dependent has a disability that prevents them from supporting themselves?
That's an important point. For injuries happening after 2003, disabled minors actually get benefits for life because their needs are obviously going to continue beyond age 18, and they might not ever be able to earn a living on their own.
That's a crucial safety net for those families. The chapter also talks about a time limit for, starting death benefit proceedings. How long do dependents have to file a claim?
Generally, they have 1 year from the date of death if the death happens within 1 year of the injury. But it can be a bit different depending on when the last benefits were paid out or if the death happened more than a year after the injury.
This is not always a clear-cut timeline.
Right. It can be tricky to figure out those timelines. So it's always a good idea to talk to an attorney who specializes in workers' comp to make sure you don't miss any important deadlines.
I think that's good advice for really any part of workers' comp. It's a complicated system, and having some expert guidance can really make all the difference.
I agree. Trying to navigate it all on your own can be really overwhelming, especially when you're dealing with the stress of an injury or the loss of a loved one.
Well, I think we've really explored this chapter in depth. We covered everything from the constitutional basis of California's workers' comp system to, the ins and outs of death benefits and everything in between.
We really did pack a lot in. Our listeners should have a good understanding now of how the system works, the different benefits that are available, and the steps to take to make sure their rights are protected.
One thing that really stood out to me is how worker-focused this whole system is. From the emphasis on getting medical treatment quickly to the protections against discrimination, it's clear that California really cares about the well-being of its workforce.
It's definitely a system that's designed to support workers when they need it most. And it's a good reminder that even though accidents happen, there are resources and protections in place to help you get back on your feet.
That's a great point. And on that note, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. Think about your own workplace. Are there any safety improvements that could be made? Or policies that could be, strengthened to prevent injuries from happening in the first place? After all, the safest workplace is the best workers' comp. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.